You said there's no names up? Oh, no.
Alright, go for it. Alrighty, so we will be presenting on the KKK tonight, specifically the KKK during the 20th century, so the period of about 1915 to 1995.
Alright, so we're going to start with a brief little discussion about the article that we had sent out, because while we do have the dates of 1915, 1995, we are going to be kind of going a little bit forward and a little bit after. So for the article, it kind of discusses KKK today, and kind of we're seeing the resurgence of these kinds of white supremacist groups following the election of Donald Trump. So we're not going to go through all these questions because we don't have time. But I just kind of want to touch base on, like, what was everyone's initial reactions to the article, like, kind of the quotes from the man named Zarth, the fact that wasn't his real name. Were you surprised? Were you not by his reasoning of Trump or anything?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. He talks a little bit about Zar's kind of lack of information, and he just doesn't seem very well informed about what's going on, and it just seems like he's in it more for the emotional reaction and just kind of that knee-jerk reaction. I feel like we see a lot coming out of Trump supporters and kind of the alt-right and everything like that.
Yeah, especially with how Zarth almost was starting to identify as a climate change believer, and yet Trump is doing all these things that are not environmentally friendly, and that's not really one of his main concerns. Anybody else? I know that I was surprised by the fact that he was more drawn to the KKK over the skinheads because of the violence that was associated with the skinheads versus the KKK, and the fact that he saw the KKK as more family-oriented, which is one of the reasons why he joined the group. I don't know if anybody else found that kind of shocked. I was like, whoa, okay. And it kind of goes back to the not so well-informed. So, anybody else? All right, let's move on.
All right. So, to start things off, the KKK can generally be separated into three separate waves of its existence. The first wave you have from 1865, which is the year that it was started, and also end of the Civil War, to 1871. The second wave is 1915 to 1944, with that about 50-year period between the first wave and the second wave. And then the third wave, which is the post-civil rights era, which doesn't have an organized KKK like the previous two eras, but is more a kind of loose conglomeration of groups. In all three waves, there is a history of violence. Within the second wave, it is not as big of a motivation as it was in the first and third waves, but it was still a presence throughout it. It is also, the KKK is also the oldest hate group in the United States, and it is that is still actively operating, I guess is the best term to use. So, the first wave KKK. The original Ku Klux Klan was formed in the aftermath of the Civil War in 1865 by a group of Confederate veterans. Contrary to popular belief, it was not formed by Nathan Bedford Forrest, who it is popularly attributed to. He was one of the first members of the original KKK, but was not the founder of the KKK. It was formed in a response to a loss of power in the aftermath of the Civil War. White men felt that they had lost control in the loss of the Civil War, and they wanted to incite fear in the newly free African American population, and they sought to do that through lynchings, lighting churches on fire, etc., etc. The original group was focused more on violence and vigilantism versus the 20th century KKK, which kind of focused more on individual acts, and they were more organized about it. The KKK existed as a legitimate group until 1871, when President Grant passed the Third Enforcement Act, which suspended habeas corpus in the southern United States in order to prosecute Ku Klux Klan members. It had been he passed the act in Congress because he saw the increase in violence during Reconstruction. It was passed within a month of it being suggested, and it was the last of these three enforcement acts. And actually, the parts of this enforcement act are still on the books in American civil law in terms of inciting violence. But this 1871 law kind of shut down the Ku Klux Klan as a active force until 1915. In 1915, a movie came out called The Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith. In it, it sort of glorified the Southern mythology that was becoming popular in the aftermath of the Civil War. From this movie, a man named William Joseph Simmons was influenced by the imagery within the movie, and at Stone Mountain, Georgia, he and a group of Southern men decided to form a new version of the KKK. The Ku Klux Klan of the 19-teens and 1920s was an entirely different beast than the original KKK. The 1920s version of the KKK was not as focused on the white supremacy aspects of it, but more on the religious aspects and the anti-immigration aspects, as well as being pro-prohibition. They formed as a response to the social tensions of the era. You had increased immigration during the 1890s and the 19-teens, and these groups were formed in mostly urban areas in comparison of the original KKK, which was mostly concentrated in southern rural areas. So Stone Mountain, where it was formed, is actually kind of an interesting place. So this is Stone Mountain. It was, construction began in 1916. It is a massive mountain outside of Atlanta, Georgia, that has a relief of 3 Confederate icons. One is Stonewall Jackson, the other is Robert E. Lee, and the other is Jefferson Davis. It was the meeting place of the Klan until the Klan disintegrated when it was officially dissolved in 1944. Construction was not completed on this until 1972. Construction started in 1916, but it wasn't finished until 1972, and it was bought by the state of Georgia, and they completed construction. In 1923, the Klan received an easement from the governor of Georgia in order to hold Klan meetings there. That easement was not removed until 1960, well into the civil rights era. So this is a graph showing when Confederate monuments were built. If you notice here, this is 1915, when the Klan is officially reborn under Wayne Joseph Simmons. And this is the high point. So it's about 1912-ish, right before the beginning of World War I. And these building of Confederate monuments can be tied to this rise in, white supremacist feelings. You have a lot of immigrants moving in, you have a lot of religious minorities moving in, and a lot of people were feeling that they were now a minority. They were not necessarily a minority. So the KKK ideology in the 1920s, as I said previously, was very different from both the first and third waves. It was much more religiously focused. It had a focus on xenophobia, religious prejudice, and white supremacy with a broadly conservative moralism. It was described by a Protestant minister as the rising of a Protestant people to take back what is their own. Anti-Catholicism was the main tenement of the early 20th century KKK. It's the reason that it was able to spread into Canada, where white supremacy hadn't really taken hold at this point, but anti-Catholicism was definitely a big thing at that point. Protestant Anglo-Saxon blood is the heart and soul of the foundation of this republic was what the Washington State KKK put in their official paper. And the Klansmen believed that non-white people were and always would be genetically inferior. And this sort of carried throughout this 20th century KKK. So how they recruited. It was described as partially as a multi-level marketing campaign because a lot of the focus of this KKK was on recruiting other members, and the men that recruited more members received part of the tuition, recruitment dues for those men, so it encouraged more people to join. But they saw themselves not as a white supremacist organization, but more of a civic organization, kind of in line with like the Lions or the Knights of Columbus. Before they would enter a new town, they would hold fairs, they would, hold flag-raising ceremonies. They kind of modeled themselves a bit after the Freemasons. And it was a very family-oriented organization. They had baseball teams. What was interesting about these baseball teams is that they would play against teams that were affiliated with Catholic organizations, Jewish organizations, African American teams. There was a tournament that they held in the 1930s against the Negro League. So it was a very successful organization. At its height, it had 4 million members across the United States. It was heavily urbanized, and leading into the 1920s towards 1925, most of its members were concentrated in the Midwest rather than the South. So why did this invisible empire in the 19-teens and 1920s come to an end? It's because of this guy. This is D.C. Stevenson. He was the Grand Dragon of the Indiana Klan and was also a recruitment manager for several of their states around him. Now, the KKK up until this point had tried to give this image of, they're following the law, they're not committing violent acts, they're good overall people who just want the white race to do well. This guy was not the best demonstration of it. In 1925, he was convicted of murdering a white woman, Madge Oberholzer, who was an educator who was working to increase literacy in the state of Indiana. He raped and murdered her on a train and was convicted of this crime. He asked the governor, who was also a Klansman, for a pardon. The governor did not give it to him, and so in response, Stevenson decided to name every single member of the Klan who was in any level of government in the state of Indiana. It led to an indictment of the governor. It led to an indictment of the governor, and it led to the resignation of many, many state officials. But the biggest blow that it dealt was it showed that the members of the Klan were not these law-abiding citizens as they had tried to show. Instead, they were committing acts of violence, just as the previous Klan had shown. And this was in 1925. The Klan itself managed to survive, quote unquote, until 1944, when the organization that had originally been formed in 1915 was officially folded as an LLC, and it remained dormant for a couple years.
So, after that second wave, around in the 1950s, we labeled it post-civil rights KKK, or the third wave, because it's after the advent of the official civil rights movement, circa around like early 1950s. And as it was said before, it was sort of just like a conglomeration of a bunch of different little independent groups that can refer to themselves as the KKK, but there was no like national organization, unifying organization among all these groups at the time. I think membership actually rose a lot higher in these smaller factions in the mid-1960s after the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then in 1975, the most mainstream or well-known faction of the KKK is called the Knights Party, founded by David Duke, who some of you probably have heard of during the last presidential campaign. Yeah.
Next slide.
Yep. Oh wait, go back. Can you? So the photos here. This is the 3 men that were killed in Mississippi during Freedom Summer in 1960. Right?
1963.
Thank you. 1963. And then the picture on the right is a photo of Emmett Till's funeral in 1955. Emmett Till was lynched for basically being accused of whistling at a waitress, and he was murdered for that. And his mother chose to have an open casket funeral to kind of show the violence that was committed against her own son. It was a very big deal. So the ideology of the KKK at this time was no longer, it was like a move away from that focus on religious belief that they had in the 20s, where they were mainly anti-Catholic. And they now promoted more of a white Christian civilization. So they seek to secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. So this is where you start to see like this white nationalist ideology being promoted. They didn't describe themselves as racist, but racialized. Racialist. Oh, sorry. Which basically is saying that they're part of this white race and white nationalism, white pride is what they're going for. And yeah, again, promoters of the white Christian civilization. So, the KKK, the third wave of the KKK is known for several acts of violence. We already talked about the Emmett Till lynching. And since then, here at the bottom here, you can see that there have been numerous acts of vandalism up until 2016, 2013, and then so on and so forth. So this is still happening today. The memorial that is dedicated to Emmett Till. In 1963, there was a bombing at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, and it killed 4 girls and injured a bunch of other people. In the 1961 Freedom Bus riders, one of their buses was bombed, and we're going to see a video of that here, I think, on the next slide. And then in 1979, there were 4 protesters and 1 bystander who were killed at a Death to the Klan march in Greensboro, North Carolina. The protesters were actually from the Communist Workers' Party, and they were chanting things about violence to the KKK to kind of make them pay for their own violent acts. The 5 people that were killed during this march were killed by the KKK and the American Nazi Party. So what's interesting about this trial, there was 9 men that were actually tried, 6 on a state level, and then all 9 of them tried at a federal level, and they were acquitted on both trials. 5 of the men were acquitted of murder. And in the state trial, the 6 men were acquitted. The jury cited self-defense. And on the federal trial, the jury cited that the men were acting on political, not racial motivations. In the mid-1980s, survivors of this massacre, they call it the Greensboro Massacre, sued the city for failure to protect the legal demonstration that they were trying to have with this march, and also for violating their civil rights. In this lawsuit, the jury found that the shooters were liable for the death of a bystander, whose name was Dr. Michael Nathan. And the only reason that they were found to be liable, another thing that was interesting about this trial, this lawsuit, was that it was one of the only few times that a jury held local police liable for cooperating with the KKK in a wrongful death, being the bystander. And the only reason that they were able to prove that is because there was an informant to the police that told them prior to the march that the KKK planned to act violently against the protesters. So the police had prior knowledge to this happening, and they still failed to protect just protesters, and 5 people died. But the only person who died was the bystander, not any members of the, the only person that was involved with this lawsuit, whose death was involved with this lawsuit, was that bystander, not anybody who was part of the Communist Party. And then in 2004 marked the 25th anniversary of the Greensboro Massacre, and 700 people ended up marching in support of Truth and Reconciliation Committee that was a result of this 2004 march. And unfortunately, the mayor and most of the city council in Greensboro voted against giving this Truth and Reconciliation Committee any rights to subpoena for the old testimonies from the original trial. So they weren't able to really find any solid evidence, and pretty much came to the conclusion that the police and the KKK were liable for the bystander's death. So nothing really new came out of that. This one first. So this is the video of the bus burning. It's a Smithsonian video, and it just kind of explains.
African Americans, since the end of slavery, have been treated in much of the country as a despised minority. They are forced to eat and use bathrooms separately from whites. James Farmer is the founder of the Congress of Racial Equality, known as CORE.
In order to understand how any Negro feels under segregation, you have to realize that from the time of infancy, he has it pounded into him that he's not as good as other people. There are things he cannot do. Don't do this, you can't do this, you can't do the other. It builds into a man a feeling of inferiority, a feeling of frustration, a feeling of resentment.
James Farmer and CORE want Kennedy to understand that segregation stains America's image around the world. CORE wants to test a Supreme Court ruling, long ignored in the South, that bans segregation in interstate travel. The plan is for black and white volunteers to ride together on buses. Journeys that Corps calls freedom rides. The riders commit themselves to nonviolence,
I want you to think it over very carefully, and if you
believing that challenging segregation peacefully will force the authorities to act.
we would be very happy to have you embark upon this dangerous, worthwhile, significant mission.
Corps prepares the riders for the racial hatred they can expect.
Hey, you, you hear what that man said? You hear what that man said? You get back there, get back. Get back, get back, get back. Hey, come on.
On May 4th, 1961, James Farmer leads 13 people, black and white, onto buses in Washington, D.C., bound for New Orleans. Ten days later, the bus enters Alabama, home to the largest KKK organization in America. They know the riders are coming. In Anniston, the Klan surrounds the bus, slashing its tires. Photographer Joe Postolione captures these images. The crippled Greyhound tries to escape, but a few miles out of town, the Klan surrounds and firebombs it, with the riders still inside. The Freedom Riders do escape the bus, only to be beaten by the Klan. Joe's photos bring the Freedom Rides to international attention.
So that was just a very brief overview of the event, and just an example of some of the violence that was perpetrated by the KKK. This video here, we're actually not going to show you because of time, but it's an Oprah episode where this gentleman here was actually a freedom rider who was on that bus and escaped, and he's reunited with a woman who was 12 years old at the time, and her family owned the convenience store, I think it was, like right next to where the bus bombing happened, and she ran out and actually with water, buckets of water, and threw it on the people that were burning, and he was one of the people that she was able to save. So heartfelt moment from Oprah. It was really nice.
Okay.
With them reunited, yeah.
African.
Alright. So we're just going to touch a little bit about the women's involvement in the KKK, because so far in some of the presentations we haven't really touched on women's involvement in these white supremacist groups, because they are there. Granted, it looks a little bit different. So women have always had a slight involvement in the KKK, less so before the 20th century and after, because for a while women were not allowed to officially join the KKK, but they were part of it in other ways, such as sewing the robes and doing kind of all the logistical involvement, and as well as having their own sections of KKK newspapers. And so in the 1920s, the women who were involved in the KKK kind of took a stance of, of arguing for standing for pure womanhood. So frequently attacking women who sought independence during the movement for women's suffrage. And for example, in Montana, in the KKK branch that was here in the 1920s, the women of the KKK presented themselves as an alternative and a respectable women's club, because they saw themselves as upholding these traditional family values, and feminism was seen as destroying the traditional family. But then as you move into the 60s and the 70s, there was a really interesting article that was in the New York Times from the 1970s where the women of the KKK began to rise through ranks through using the women's liberation movement rhetoric. And some male Klans members actually, this is a quote from one of them saying that we don't have any prohibitions or constitutional limitations regarding women. In fact, some of our best members are women. So it's kind of interesting to see that before, in the 1920s, kind of the ideas behind like what it meant to be a woman versus the rhetoric that was then used in the 70s is kind of an interesting contradiction. Next slide, please. So we're also going to talk a little bit about the structure of the KKK. So first of all, it's very difficult to find a lot of the logistics of the structure of the KKK and its power structure. So what we're going to pass around is a pamphlet from 1915, and it actually kind of has a little bit of a breakdown of, I think on the third page, fourth page, the next one. Yeah, so it says the name. So for example, president of the KKK was known, in that chapter, was known as the Exalted Cyclops. The vice president was known as the Clawlith, and the lecturer was known as the Clockguard. So they all start with K, even though it starts with C. We kind of have a funny little political cartoon on the next slide that kind of puts a little play on the K's and the use of that. So power structure devolved with the dissolution of the original KKK. And there's also sort of four main branches in the post-civil rights KKK. So the Brotherhood of the Klans, the Church of the National Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, Imperial Klans of America, and the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. And so there may be like a complex power structure that exists during in the KKK. However, the main source of knowledge comes from the Bible. And it's, yeah, like I said, it's very difficult to find a lot of information. Yeah, for sure.
So on the part of the four main branches of the KKK post-civil rights, most of the information that we got from here is from informers that were put there by various federal agencies. The one main branch that the federal agencies were never able to get into was this first one, the Brotherhood of Klans. They were very good about hiding where they were meeting, who their members were, and throughout its existence, it still managed to remain very secretive. But the third one, the fourth one, which is the one associated with David Duke, federal agencies, and in response, the internet has the most amount of information available because it was so widely distributed post 1975.
So this is the kind of goofy political cartoon that we found, just because everything it starts with K, and you can see even in the pamphlet where they talk about the creed, all of the words that start with C have been replaced with K. Okay. Yes.
So, what does it look like today, the organization or the conglomerate of KKK organizations? It should be noted that the defining date that we chose for the end of the third wave of the KKK was 1995, because that was actually the advent of Stormfront.org, right?
Yeah, so Stormfront is a online message board, I guess is the best way to describe it. It was started in 1995, and it was the kind of turning point of white supremacy and the KKK in particular. It's when they entered the internet realm, and post-1995, the internet became the most important recruiting tool for the KKK rather than the more acts of violence that had previously been the main event, I guess is the best way to put it.
So in that article, I think Zarth even talks about the internet being part of, like, kind of reinforcing this whole idea of the invisible empire. Because people can remain largely anonymous through websites like Stormfront and whatnot. So some things, the Southern Poverty Law Center says, this quote here, "Klan is strong when its leaders are able to capitalize on social tensions and the fears of white people. As its popularity escalates and its fanaticism leads to violence, there is greater scrutiny by law enforcement, the press, and the government. The Klan loses whatever public acceptance it had, and disputes within the ranks finally destroy its effectiveness as a terrorist organization." So I feel like that quote helps explain a little bit about the rise of white nationalist membership in the past few years. And that article also goes a little bit deeper into why that particular gentleman joined the KKK during the Obama administration and whatnot. Another thing they do is recruit young children through videos on YouTube and also through pamphlets. Here, let me see this real quick. So these two pieces of paper we'll pass around here are just some examples of documents that they use. So there's some application forms. Here's a picture from 1913. This one down on the bottom here, the heart one, was passed out just within the past year. And it was a Valentine's themed KKK propaganda for kids. It was awesome.
This one right now, too?
Yeah. They also use more mass gatherings to gain support, so different rallies and whatnot, and different protests like the one we saw in Charlottesville. And they use major acts of violence as recruiting tools as well, such as the 2015 South Carolina massacre in the, sorry, I have it written down, let me make sure I get it right. The Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in South Carolina. And a couple, I think, interesting notes about that church is it's the oldest AME church in the South, and Dan Mark Vesey was one of the founders. And if you guys aren't aware of who Dan Mark Vesey is, he led a slave revolt in, a slave revolt in 1822. And just an example of how they use that as recruitment. The afternoon before the shooting, the shooter wrote on an online statement that, this quote, "We have no skinheads, no real KKK, no one doing anything but talking on the internet. Well, someone has to have the bravery to take it to the real world, and I guess that has to be me." And later that evening, he killed 9 people who were there for a Bible study. One of them, I think, was actually a state senator.
He was the pastor.
The pastor was the state, yeah. Another thing just about the shooter, just a few hours after he was apprehended by the police, they took him to the Burger King drive-thru because he was hungry. This is an example of a KKK rally in 1989, marching with all their flags.
Okay. So to touch a little bit more base on the media coverage of the KKK, especially kind of what we've been seeing recently, especially with the election of Trump, is according to David Chalmers and his book, Hooded Americanism, he argued that media coverage can help to revive the KKK through news stories, photos, etc. How it kind of like brings them to light, and it brings, you see the images and you're like, oh my God, what is, like, this is still happening, it sparks a reaction. And however, it's very interesting to kind of see how the media kind of treats these, and it's kind of what we discussed when I can't remember her name, who came in and talked about
Peggy Kerr?
Yeah, when Peggy Kerr came in and discussed covering in Spokane and things like that, like where's the line, how do we cover this kind of stuff? It's the same kind of deal here. So for instance, in the Montana branches of the KKK, the media would treat women with a little bit more like sympathy as opposed to with the men. And it kind of also brings into question, like, how is media coverage for stuff like this versus African American groups like the Black Panthers or Black Lives Matter movement, because sometimes the media can portray these kinds of groups as these hate groups, and whereas in reality, then you also have white hate groups as well. Mm-hmm.
So again, the KKK today, as I was saying earlier, that David Duke, who was the founder of the Knights Party in 1975, is a very outspoken supporter of Donald Trump. And then groups such as Thomas Grobb's Knights of the Ku Klux Klan are attempting to revamp the image of the KKK through new media and grow its online presence. Now here's an example of a kid's show. It's only a couple minutes long, so we have time. It's called The Andrew Show, and there's a few episodes on YouTube. It is flagged as potentially offensive.
And they're
on YouTube. Yeah.
What was the name of it?
The Andrew Show. And Andrew his name's Andrew Pendergraft, and he's the son of Thomas Robb.
And this came out in 2009?
He was 9 years old.
Just a warning, there is,
It's pretty
there's
disturbing.
language.
Shocking.
Yeah, so just be aware.
Thankfully, their budget isn't too big. It's good these things like this.
It was really good. We had singing, games, and we baked cookies. We made frosting, and my mom taught us about the frosting. And when you put different colors in it, the white frosting, it can never be white again, which is how it is when you erase mix, pretty much. And have you heard of the show called 16? It has race mixing, it has propaganda, and the main characters, one of them's black, one of them's Mexican, and some of them are white. And pretty much, tune in next week. Bye.
So that's awesome.
Yeah, that's the,
Yeah, we were in such a
Oh, we forgot that.
Can you pause it?
Yeah.
yeah, let me just go back. Sorry about that. I'm just gonna, so that's what it says. We good?
So in every single one of these episodes, Andrew is seen reading something. So this isn't something that he's making up on the spot, but he has read it. There's a couple where he has like one of his friends with him the whole time, and we found this kid's Facebook too. It's kind of
And his Twitter.
Yeah,
but he like dove deep into this kid's social media.
Yeah, but it's interesting though because throughout the social media, there's not all of this same kind of rhetoric that he's portraying.
17 or 18?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's like 18 now.
He's not very present on social media. But.
I think he's a commit at Penn State.
Mm-hmm. So, and then this graph here just shows the number of known playing groups in the United States since 2000 to 2016. By the end of 2016, there was 130 known groups throughout the country.
Sorry to interrupt, but in 2014, there was only 72. Do you guys know why exactly, what exactly happened to make you?
No, unfortunately.
The SPLC did some major suits against them, the KKK, and bankrupted a number of them.
Do you know why the number was so high in 2010? Because there's 221.
The only explanation I can give for that is 2 years after.
That's what I was
From the
thinking.
White House.
Yeah.
And you have the rise of the Tea Party movement during the 2010 midterms.
Yeah, I think that's when Congress took over.
Yeah, it's
Or
like
the Republicans
Republicans
took over
took
Congress as well.
took the House.
So we have a couple more videos that we're not really going to have time to show, but we'll try to explain them real quick. The Birth of a Nation in 5 minutes is actually super interesting because it took us really by surprise.
Yeah.
Because it seems to be kind of just giving an overview, like a summary of what this film is, and then all of a sudden it starts going into this sort of racist rhetoric, justifying the need for the film.
Yeah.
In
like a minute and a half in. So you're watching this, and all of a sudden you're like, oh,
yeah,
this is not what I thought.
yeah, this is pretty interesting. We were watching it thinking it was going to be a good video to show everybody about what the Birth of a Nation is, and then we were like, wait a minute,
nope.
We had to actually go back and listen to it a few times. So it's pretty convincing propaganda that is being narrated over this video. And then the second video here is of Donald Trump on August 15th, 2017, I think, just a few days after the Charlottesville riots. And this is, I wanted to find this quote of him saying there was bad people on both sides, and I think everybody's remember that. And so it turns out at 9 minutes and 50 seconds into this video, he goes on for 4 or 5 minutes, just saying the same thing over and over again, defending white nationalists and KKK and whatnot. Yeah.
About 30 more seconds.
So the reason we're just going to talk about that is because we talked a little bit about how the media portrays the KKK. We were going to ask a question, but
All right.
20 seconds if you guys want to ask a question.
Yeah, any questions? 20 seconds left.
Sorry if this was so rushed.
It's not your fault at all, so
Okay.
let's just give them a round of applause.
We have a lot of cool things I want to say, but we didn't have time.
My apologies. for that.
That's all
No,
right.
it's okay.
It was a really interesting talk.
Yeah, well, so next week,
The Andrew show is terrifying.
we have our final group presenting, you guys, who's there, you all ready?
Yeah.
And then we will have a presentation from an anti-human